let's start with a brief explanation of exactly what the Fees for Intervention scheme is and how it will work.
Okay, well, let's start with what the scheme is designed to deliver. The government decided that it was wrong that the taxpayer should foot the bill for HSE's efforts in putting right material contraventions and breaches of the law. They felt that that should rest with those who created that risk and failed to manage it in the first place. So the policy objective is to transfer those costs from the taxpayer to businesses who are in breach. The second point is that will also hopefully incentivise compliance. It will be another reason why it is a good thing to comply rather than not comply. And thirdly, it will level the playing field between those businesses who do invest in making sure that their employees are protected and those who seek to undercut them. So that's the objectives of the scheme. The way it actually operates is that if somebody is in a material breach of law and an inspector finds that out at a visit, whether it be an inspection or an investigation, then they will recover the costs of their time spent on identifying that breach and everything that they do connected with it until the point that it is actually rectified. So that's the nature of the scheme, and that will be charged at an hourly rate of £124 per hour.
Okay, so could you just give us some clarification on the likely charges that we're looking at?
Well, the charges that people are going to face from the 1st of October of this year, which is when this comes into force, is £124 per hour. That's a charge that reflects the costs of our organisation of keeping somebody, an inspector, on the road visiting. So it's the costs of accommodation, IT, salaries of course, travel and subsistence that keeps them on the road. So as those costs change, so will the hourly rate change. So it was £130 odd in the consultation document that we issued last summer. We've revised our cost base, so that's been reflected in the new hourly rate. And we will keep looking at that on an annual basis to see whether it is still justified and make whatever changes are necessary.
What about the charges over and above the hourly charge, though? Things like sort of writing of letters and that kind of thing.
Well, let's be clear, the hourly rate applies to the writing of letters. So for instance, if we did an hour's visit, we went back to the office and spent half an hour writing a letter, returned to the site to do half an hour's check visit to make sure that the matter was put right, that's 2 hours in total of our time, and that will be charged at 2 times £124 an hour, which is £248.
So just to be clear, the figure of £750 for a letter,
that's indicative. It was just to give people some idea of the likely charges, but it is dependent on the time that we take. And it's partly dependent on how efficient we are in dealing with these matters, but it is also very crucially dependent on how quickly businesses put right their contraventions. If they move quickly to sort it out and then can demonstrate that to us, the less time do we need to spend on it, and therefore the smaller the bill will be that they have to face at the end of the day.
Okay, now in terms of those transgressions, as it were, what constitutes a material breach under these?
Well, when we set off with this scheme, we were very keen to make sure that people were not facing costs for, first of all, costs for complying with the law, but secondly, weren't facing costs for trivial issues, issues that do not lead to risk. So for instance, we would not generally charge for or recover our costs for the display of a health and safety poster. We would advise the company to go out and buy one and put it up and leave it at that. So we wanted to pitch things at material breaches, those things which are significant. And so what we do, inspectors use a tool which is called the enforcement management model, which is basically their way of assessing what is the risk that we see, so who is going to be harmed and how badly and how many of them. What does the law require the business to do in these circumstances, and what is the gap between the two? And it's the size of that gap, what the expectations are versus the risk that is being run, that leads an inspector to say, am I going to advise? Am I going to write a letter? Am I going to serve a notice? Or am I going to prosecute? And if they are required to write a letter, then that is or a notice or a prosecution, those are the triggers for fee for intervention to apply.
Okay, now obviously we're coming off the tail end of a recession, and a lot of demolition contractors are feeling the pinch already. The timing of this could have been better, surely.
Right. I guess industry would say, when is the timing right for some of these sorts of things? So I guess There will be people who objected to it at any time. I'll answer this in two ways. First of all, by saying, instead of looking at safety and health as an expense, think about the consequences. For a small demolition contractor, say employing 4 people, think of the consequences of them having an accident and losing one of their people, so 25% of their workforce gets carried out on a stretcher. That, for me, is bad business if that is a skilled worker upon whom you are dependent. So think of safety as something which actually benefits the business and can save costs. So getting it right first time is something that is not just beneficial to the workers, but it's beneficial to the business. And second point is go back to the point I made earlier. Comply with the law, you don't face any charge whatsoever. If you do fail to comply with the law, get it sorted out quickly, and then your costs will be minimised.
This question comes courtesy of Howard Button, the Chief Executive of the National Federation of Demolition Contractors. And it's a point of clarification, really, on what point charges start to apply.
Yep.
Does it apply from the moment that the inspector steps on site, or from the moment that he identifies a breach until that breach is rectified?
Yeah. It's the first of those. If we go onto site, and I gave the example earlier of an hour's site visit, if we come across the material breach partway into that visit, we will still cost recover for that full hour's activity, and then everything subsequent to that which is connected with the material breach that we identified. See, inspectors, when they visit a site, they're taking a view on, do we think this organisation is managing its health and safety adequately? In order to do that, they have to look at the findings from their whole inspection. And one of the things that might weigh, for instance, in a firm's favour is, what did the breach that I identify, was that some small error that was made in the context of basically a very well-run site? And that can be a factor that the inspector takes into account as to whether they write to the company, in which case fee for intervention would apply, or whether they simply advise them. So in order to take into account the whole context of the visit and what the employer is like, then that's why we charge or cost recover for the whole of that visit.
Okay. Looking at that, a good number of site accidents are down to management or lack of training, or the wrong type of training and that kind of thing. So, particularly given the current economic climate, penalising financially a company for a breach then renders them less likely or less able to invest in training that might have addressed that.
Right.
How do you...
First of all, we're not issuing a penalty, we are recovering the costs of our efforts. I think it's important to say that. The second point, though, is if you know that that's the problem, if you know that our training is deficient, you being a business who's involved in demolition, get it sorted. It's not in your interest to go along like that now. You know that's the problem, you know what's required to put it right, do it now, and when the inspector calls, no problem. So get it right up front, get it right first time, and you will both have a safer business, and as a consequence of that, you will face less of an impact from fee for intervention.
There is a potential double whammy there, though, isn't there? There are a number of demolition contracts these days that have a clause within them, a non-completion of works or a late completion, and it carries a financial penalty. So if there is a health and safety breach, demolition contractors could actually end up being penalised financially twice.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, the costs of non-compliance are significant in all sorts of ways. They're significant for the business, as we mentioned before, in terms of lost employees and lost skills to the organisation. There are costs incurred in what the regulator has to do to put that right, and that's what we need to recover. There are costs on the National Health Service that get borne by the taxpayer. So there are all sorts of costs incurred, including insurance costs. So I go back to the point that we can avoid all these costs by sitting down in advance and thinking about what are our problems, what are our risks, what are the solutions to those, let's implement them in a sensible way, and then we minimise the risk of any of these costs arising in the first place.
Looking at your team, your HSE inspectors, is there not a danger that they will move from what is currently an advisory policing role to a traffic warden, a revenue generator?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a risk that businesses have told us that they fear, but I think that won't be the case for a number of reasons. The first is, if people can see that we are not changing our behaviour, if they can see that we are still relating, for instance, the targeting of our visits to sites that present the highest risk or the poorest performers, if they can see that once we're there, our decisions are driven by our standard decision-making processes like the enforcement management model that I mentioned earlier, if they can see, if you like, an unchanged HSE in that environment, then there's no reason why their perception of what HSE is about should change. And we will not have targets for revenue generation, either as an organisation or at the individual level. Revenue will flow from the identification of material breaches that we come across.
Okay, now I mean, I'm sure you'll understand this, that there are fears among demolition contractors and probably other industries as well, I would guess, that an inspector that is effectively revenue generating will stay on a site or will probe a site further until they actually find something wrong. What reassurance can you offer on that? We
are actually wanting to move in the opposite direction because, bear in mind, HSE, even with fee for intervention, is a smaller organisation. Its resources are shrinking. We, therefore, need to make inspections, if I can put it this way, shorter and sharper encounters. What we do, the posh word for it is diagnostic inspections. That is, we look for, you know, what is the picture that's emerging in mind about the competence of this organisation to manage health and safety, not an exhaustive inspection which is, right, we've seen everything that this business does now and it's only at that point are we going to come to a view. We don't do that, and we're going to do less of that even in the future because of this point about we need to get in, we need to come to a view quickly, we need to take action if there's something wrong. If there's not, we need to get out and go somewhere else where there is a problem, because we've not got the resources and the luxury to spend that amount of time with businesses. Okay. Just how transparent will the scheme be? I mean, will it be possible for a demolition contractor to compare pre-FFI to post-FFI? You know, as you say, sort of length of visits, depth of visits, and that kind of thing. Sure. Well, they will be able to judge from their own experience if they come across it. But what we are committed to do is to publish a report, which is a report on the first 12 months operation of the scheme. And that will have facts and figures in it, how many material breaches, what's the sectoral breakdown of where those material breaches occurred, what is the level of money that's been recovered through this process, what's the level of disputes, and how many have been successful, all those sorts of issues we will be setting out in a published document. So whether it will quite go down to the level of, you know, in a subsector of, for instance, construction, which demolition is, and we will be able to say, you know, length of a visit before fee for intervention and after fee for intervention, we don't have the information to do that. But we will provide a lot of information against which people can make some judgments about were the fears that we suspected of HSE changing its targeting, changing its decision making, have those come to pass or not. So that report, I think, will be quite important for people to read. There is a rumour, as there always is with these things, that the HSE actually has a financial target in mind to claw back through the FFI scheme. Is there any truth in the £30 million first year that's being bandied around? Yeah, I mean, there is truth in a figure of 30 plus million, which we included in the impact assessment that supported the measure. That's the, what is the cost of business, what are the benefits of the proposal. It's a piece of standard kind of government machinery that you go through. But that was an estimate based on historical levels of, you know, what are the levels of material breaches, contraventions that we find when we do inspections and investigations, and what would that equate to in terms of money once this thing comes into force. So that was an estimate that's a necessary part of assessing how much this is going to cost business. It's not a target. It's not a target for revenue generation for the organisation, and there won't be one. Obviously, we'll have to have estimates as part of our financial planning, but that's very different from saying that they will be a target which we must deliver. So individual HSE inspectors or regional HSE offices do not have a target to meet? No. Another concern, there's always a concern, another concern is probably more among the larger, more established and more reputable demolition contractors in the UK.
that they will be unfairly targeted, because if they are penalised, they, for a start they're visible, but they've also got the means to pay, whereas there is a lower echelon of demolition contractors who would perhaps take liquidation over a financial penalty any day. Is there any reassurance there for the big guys?
Well, there's reassurance in the sense that we target our effort based on evidence of what is causing accidents and ill health, and that leads us to develop inspection programs which are targeted at those sectors of business. So let me give you an example. Some years ago, we used to target large construction contractors because we felt that's where the problem lay, but that has changed now. A lot of large construction companies have, you can put it crudely, got their act together and are managing health and safety, and that's been shown in improved performance coming through the accident stats and the ill health stats. So we've shifted the focus of our attention in that industry to smaller scale operators, for instance involved in refurbishment activities, because that's where the evidence tells us the problem lies. Back to that 1 year on published report I mentioned, this should give people an idea of, okay, you said in your business plans, HSE, that these were the target industries that you were going to select and why. The 1 year on published report will be able to, people will be able to see whether actually we've done that or whether there's been some change that might have been brought about by fee for intervention. But it should not affect the targeting of our effort. We're very clear on that point.
Looking at the way that the HSE has worked in recent years with its individual initiatives and campaigns, you know, be it asbestos, slips and trips, that kind of thing, how will that time with the FFI, will industry get a heads up that this is going to be our next target area, you best get your act straight on this, because this is the next bit that we're going to be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, if we do target through campaigns of that sort, then obviously giving people some idea of what those are and what our expectations are, I think is an important part of this process. And one of the things that we're doing, not in the context of fee for intervention, but more generally, is reviewing all our guidance to make sure that it is simple, clear and easily understood, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think making the kind of demystify health and safety and making it clear and simple will help operators comply with the law. So that's something that we're generally doing, which I think will have an impact on construction industry generally.
In the run-up to the last election, there was talk about the idea of earned autonomy for certain industry sectors or certain industry activities. And I know that the demolition industry, particularly the members of the National Federation of Demolition Contractors, who have their own site audit scheme, obviously we're hoping that they would benefit from that earned autonomy. The fee for intervention scheme seems to go against that in some ways.
Okay, well let's look at that from two perspectives. The first is, I mentioned the direction of travel that HSE is taking generally, which is to concentrate only on high risk and poor performing sectors with its inspection activity. This came out of Minister Grayling, as he was then, statement in March of last year called Good Health and Safety, Good for Everyone. As a consequence of that, HSE is doing a third fewer proactive inspections than it did before. So that idea that is in that statement is we should not be proactively inspecting those firms who are low risk and in compliance is part of that scene. I think it's important to say that for industry. The second element of that, though, is that in terms of when we do visit, we take into account how well management is organising health and safety, and if they can demonstrate that they do have systems, procedures, culture, processes in place to manage their risks, and that is evidenced by what we see, then back to the issue of targeting poor performance and high risk, we would give some credit for that, and that will be reflected in how frequently we visit that firm. Not through the sort of rather more formal route that I think you were suggesting, i.e. if somebody's got a scheme of their own, then we will not visit. But that is a feature that is taken into account in our general targeting of activity.
Is there not a danger that the larger contractors who tend to do the larger job, are they not going to get more of a focus than the contractors that they're there and gone in 3 days.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that's part of our targeting effort, which is improving the intelligence base, the information that we have, which enables us to discriminate between Joe Blogg's demolition contractor, who is generally, performing well, and we've got a history and a track record, or they have, that they can demonstrate is performing well, as against another firm where we've run into problems before, and it's that latter group that we would need to target for our inspections. But that does depend on us having the intelligence and information to support that. And one of the things that we've been doing in our Field Operations Directorate and Construction Division, which deals with your industry, is very much improving that intelligence so that we can be a little more discriminating in where we put our efforts.
Obviously the focus of today is demolition, and obviously that's an offshoot of construction. How many other industry sectors are falling under the FFI scheme?
Well, nobody is exempt from it other than those sectors which are enforced by local authority inspectors, which I would tend not to be in the construction sector. So nobody's immune from inspection. If we get a piece of intelligence, which could be an accident report, it could be an insurance report, or it could be that we've had recent dealings with that firm which suggests that they're not managing health and safety well, then we can visit. But what we said for our proactive inspection activity, the sectors that we're concentrating our attention on are construction, are environmental waste and recycling activities, and part of manufacturing activities, because it's those sectors where the evidence suggests are creating the biggest problems in terms of accidents and ill health.
Is this just the tip of the iceberg? It strikes me that if the HSE becomes self-sufficient and revenue generating, there's no going back from that.
Well, that remains to be seen. In addition to the first year report, there is built into the regulations, the health and safety fees regulations, which implement fee for intervention, there's a 3-year review period, and that has to be a published report, and that has to state whether the regulations are meeting their desired policy intent. And there's a 5-year sunset clause. So after 5 years, the regulations lapse unless it can be demonstrated that there is still a need for them. So there are review periods built into this. At 1 year, we're doing our own report. At 3 years, there's a broader legislative review. And at 5 years, the sunset clause and the need to justify the measure anew will stand. So it's not something that is necessarily in a tablet of stone. It will be subject to that review and scrutiny process.
In terms of individual FFI charges to an individual demolition contractor, is there any kind of appeal process in place?
Yes, there are a couple of processes that I'll mention. One is, first of all, a query. There will be a phone line that people can contact if they receive an invoice and they're not clear about any aspect of it. I don't understand what this is for, or I don't understand the basis for the amount that's charged. Then we will be able to answer that query. The next stage is, right, I now understand the invoice, but I don't like it and I disagree with it, either because I don't think there was a material breach that should have triggered it, or I don't think the time that is being billed for is reasonable. Then people can raise a dispute on that. And we have a disputes process which has 2 stages, a first stage which is an internal management review, and then a second stage where we bring in an independent person, somebody who is not part of HSE, to help adjudicate on that case.
Can you explain to me how the process works actually on a site? So the HSE inspector has arrived, he's identified an issue that he believes will lead to an FFI charge. How is that communicated to the owner of the company, or the site manager, or whatever?
First of all, the inspector will let them know. First of all, they have to let them know that there is a breach and have a conversation about what that is and what action is expected. But then the inspector will also say, and this has implications for cost recovery, and they have a leaflet that they can leave for the business which explains what that will be. They would then go away and they would do whatever activity is necessary in accordance with our existing procedures, as I say, write a letter, issue a notice, follow up with a check visit if necessary, and then an invoice would follow from our organisation for that firm to pay, and we would send out invoices 4 times a year at set points in the year, and we would ask that those be paid in 30 days. And if not, then we would pursue debt recovery processes, or of course the firm, as we mentioned earlier, could raise a dispute about that issue. That's all explained in guidance which is available now on HSE's website, which explains fee for intervention, it explains how it operates, it also gives examples of the sorts of situations across health, safety and other issues that we would regard as material breaches. So I do urge your members to go and have a look at that guidance, and there's also information on how to pursue a query or a dispute as well.